This presentation here is to show an example of what a student can do with Shadow Puppet. This could be done through small presentations like the one I'm going to do now. I am just going to talk through each one as if I'm showing this to the class, just saying what I know about each period. This presentation is going to be a small educational piece on medieval Japan, which started at the end of the Japanese classical era at 1185. The first one was the Kamakura Shogunate, which went from 1185 to 1333. This was led by the Hojo family. The second one was the Muromachi period from 1133 until 1568. This was led by the Ashikaga Shogunate. The last one from 1600 till 1868 was the Edo period, led by the Tokugawa Shogunate. The end of it at 1868 was the Meiji Restoration, where Emperor Meiji tried to modernize Japan. The two most important people in Japanese society were the emperor, which had roots back to the Minamoto families and were considered the leader of Japanese society. This was a hereditary class, but they did not hold the true power. The true power was held by the shogunate, which the image here is Tokugawa Ieyasu, the first shogunate of the Edo period in 1600, started in 1600. And the shogunate was the true power. It was a military power that controlled all aspects of Japan. The daimyo, which controlled the small provinces and stuff, swore loyalty to them. The next class are the daimyo. These are samurai warriors that were noblemen who controlled provinces or large chunks of land. They had samurai that worked under them. They had farmers that tilled their land. They would use this rice to pay their samurai, and they swore loyalty to the shogunate. During a few different times, during the 3 different periods, for example, it was daimyo that rose up and started a new shogunate. This one right here of Oda Nobunaga was a daimyo that rose up against the Ashikaga shogunate, and he was the most powerful one. Although it didn't unify Japan, Tokugawa Ieyasu ended up doing that. He took over large chunks before he was assassinated. The next group were the samurai. This made up roughly 10% of the Japanese society. These were a warrior class that followed Bushido, which I will talk about later. All of the previous classes, the daimyo, the shogun, the emperor, they are all considered part of the samurai class as well. These are the ruling class. They spent their time doing tea ceremonies, poetry, Chinese calligraphy, and most of the time practicing for war. They practiced with many different weapons, although the longbow and the longbow and katana, and which was the long sword, and wakizashi, which is the short one, were their main weapons of choice. But many of them used, like you can see in the image here, they had the spear here, I forgot what the name is, but they had many different weapons as well. The katana and the wakizashi were the defining class weapons. They were worn with them at all times. You can see here they're wearing both of them on their waist. These were what defined them as samurais. Without those, they wouldn't be considered so. The next class, which made up the rest of the 90% of the population, were the farmer class and the merchants. The farmers were considered higher class. The farmers and artisans were considered higher class than the merchants, with the farmers being higher than the artisans. This was because they did all the growing of food, kept the country alive, so to say. While artisans did a little bit, they created tools that were needed, but in Japanese societies, merchants were considered the lowest class because they felt that they didn't do anything. They just made money off of moving items that were made by others around, and were not really that important to society. Here's a good example of a pyramid showing the different class systems. As you can see, the warrior class is on top. The emperor was also considered part of the warrior class as well, but he was more of a little bit of a different figure. As you can see, it shows the shogun second right here, but in all truth, it was not the shogun that was second. The shogun had the most power in the country. The daimyo's answer to the shogun. The emperor is more there as just a figurehead rather than anything of power. Another interesting group right here is the ronins. These guys were masterless samurai, so they're still part of the samurai class, but didn't have a daimyo to work under. So usually they were pretty poor. So the samurai were paid by rice and got their titles due to the daimyo's influence. These ronin had no samurai daimyo to work under, so they wandered the land. Many of them formed groups of banditry. They would attack peasants. They would take items. A lot of them were really poor. Some of them had some wealth. There's even times where they sold their swords, which was their class, to the merchants who would pretend to be samurai, in order to have some sort of wealth. Lots of times they would just wander around poor and be able, but wouldn't go to peasants, artisans, or merchants because they didn't want to lose their class. But many of them were really poor. And as you can see at the bottom, most of the population are the peasants, artisans, and merchants, with the peasants being 90% of that population. And it goes in that order, as explained earlier. The samurai followed a code called Bushido. The code was a code held by honor, loyalty, and bravery, which was held at the highest regard. They had their loyalties to their lord, which were the daimyo, or the shogun. A lot of these were vassals of these states. They were paid by rice. They spent their time practicing poetry, practicing writing, and most of all practicing war, horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, and stuff like that. In 1868, the Commodore Perry came from the United States and forced Japan to open its borders and trade. They gave them 1 year to be able to do this. If they didn't do it, then they would come back and make them do it. During this time, the Japanese society realized that they had to open up the doors because their technology and their way of life would not live very long if they did not modernize. There were some fights. There's the famous Ronins who rose up, but for the most part, it was pretty smooth. They took power, overdid the thing, and were ready when Commodore Perry came back to open up treaties. This was done by Emperor Meiji in the picture here. He is the one that started the Meiji Restoration and brought the end of medieval Japan and the control of samurais. And that's about it. Thank you very much.